Every evening, somewhere between 6 and 7 o'clock, an entire nation sat down together. Families pulled chairs closer to a glowing screen, dinner plates balanced on laps, children quieted, and a trusted voice, calm, measured, authoritative, told America what had happened in the world that day. Walter Cronkite, Huntley and Brinkley, Edward R. Murrow. These were not just journalists, they were institutions. They were the men America trusted when it trusted nothing else. Not politicians, not corporations, not neighbors with different opinions. When Cronkite said the Vietnam War was unwinnable in 1968, President Lyndon Johnson reportedly turned off the television and said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." That is how much power the American news anchor held. Now, what if I told you that for a period spanning nearly 3 decades, from the late 1940s to the mid-1970s, a significant portion of what those anchors said, what those newspapers printed, and what those magazines featured had been reviewed, shaped, or in some cases, directly written by the Central Intelligence Agency? Not as a theory, not as speculation, as a documented congressional record, government-admitted fact. This is the story of Operation Mockingbird. And if you grew up watching American news between 1950 and 1975, this story is about you. To understand Operation Mockingbird, you have to go back to 1947. The Cold War had just begun. The Soviet Union had atomic ambitions. Communist ideology was spreading across Europe, Asia, and Latin America with alarming speed. And the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency faced a problem that no weapon could solve. The problem was perception. America could win every military engagement and still lose the Cold War if the American public lost faith, if allied nations drifted toward neutrality, if the global narrative of the conflict was written by Moscow instead of Washington. Information was a battlefield, and the CIA had no troops deployed there. Frank Wisner changed that. Wisner was a former OSS officer, the wartime intelligence agency that preceded the CIA. He was brilliant, driven, and utterly convinced that covert influence operations were not just useful, they were essential to American survival. In 1948, he was placed in charge of a new division called the Office of Policy Coordination. Its mandate, buried in classified documents, was to conduct propaganda, economic warfare, and subversion, while maintaining plausible deniability for the U.S. government. Wisner called his network of influence assets the mighty Wurlitzer, after the theater organ that could produce any sound, any mood, any emotional effect at the touch of a key. He was not speaking metaphorically. By the early 1950s, Wisner had established relationships, some paid, some ideological, some coerced, with journalists, editors, and media executives across the most influential outlets in America. The list, as later pieced together by congressional investigators and journalists, included individuals at the New York Times, Newsweek, CBS, Time Magazine, the Associated Press, United Press International, and dozens of smaller regional publications. Approximately 400 journalists, by the CIA's own internal estimates, had some form of relationship with the agency over the program's lifespan. 400. That is not infiltration. That is ownership. I want you to think about something very specific right now. Think about the news you watched as a young adult, the stories that shaped how you understood the Vietnam War, how you understood Cuba, how you understood the Soviet threat, how you understood civil unrest, student protests, political assassinations. You formed opinions based on that coverage, real opinions, opinions that may have affected how you voted, who you trusted, what you believed about your country and the world. Now ask yourself, how much of that coverage was genuinely independent? We'll come back to that. Operation Mockingbird did not work the way most people imagine when they hear the word propaganda. It was not crude. It was not clumsy. It was not Soviet-style state television with obvious manipulation. It was elegant. The CIA did not typically dictate stories. What they did was far more sophisticated and far more effective. They planted stories in foreign media first. A fabricated or exaggerated report would appear in an Italian newspaper or a West German publication. Then, American journalists, either wittingly or unwittingly, would pick up that foreign report and reprint it as international news. The story had laundered itself. It now appeared to be independently verified foreign coverage, not American government propaganda. This technique had a name inside the agency: blowback. For journalists who were directly on the CIA's payroll or operating under formal agreements, the arrangement was more explicit. They would receive guidance, sometimes gentle, sometimes direct, about which stories to pursue, which angles to emphasize, and which stories to bury entirely. One of the most documented examples involved Cord Meyer, a CIA officer who managed a significant portion of the media influence program in the 1950s and 60s. Meyer was well connected in East Coast journalism circles and used those connections systematically to ensure that certain narratives reached the American public and others did not. The stories that were suppressed were often as consequential as the stories that were planted. American military failures that were downplayed, CIA coups in foreign nations, Guatemala in 1954, Iran in 1953, that were framed as spontaneous popular uprisings, the true scale of domestic surveillance programs, the actual costs and conduct of covert wars. The American public did not receive this information, not because journalists failed to find it, but because editors and network executives with CIA relationships ensured it never made it to print or broadcast. The mighty Wurlitzer played exactly the notes Frank Wisner wanted, and America listened and called it the evening news. Now, here is the part that should make you genuinely angry. The journalists who participated in this program were not all naive. Some were true believers, convinced they were protecting America from communist influence by controlling the narrative. Some were paid. Some were given access, prestige, and career advancement in exchange for cooperation. And the ones who refused, the ones who asked too many questions or got too close to a story the CIA wanted buried, their careers had a way of stalling. Their sources dried up. Their editors suddenly lost interest in their pitches. The system did not need to be violent to be effective. It just needed to control who got to speak and who got to be heard. Operation Mockingbird did not stay hidden forever. In 1974, investigative journalist Seymour Hersh published a landmark piece in the New York Times revealing that the CIA had been conducting illegal domestic surveillance operations on a massive scale. It was the crack in the wall. Congress responded by forming two investigative committees, the Church Committee in the Senate and the Pike Committee in the House. What they found between 1975 and 1976 was beyond what most legislators had imagined possible. Senator Frank Church, the Idaho Democrat who chaired the Senate investigation, held up a CIA dart gun in a public hearing and declared that the American people had a right to know that their intelligence agency had operated for decades without meaningful oversight or accountability.
The Church Committee's final report documented the CIA's media relationships explicitly. It confirmed that the agency had used American journalists as assets. It confirmed the existence of influence operations targeting domestic public opinion, which was and remains illegal under the CIA's founding charter, which prohibits domestic operations. CIA Director Colby, testifying before Congress, acknowledged the program's existence. And then, almost immediately, the story began to fade. The networks covered the Church Committee hearings with notably less intensity than the subject matter deserved. The newspaper investigation slowed. Public attention, already exhausted by Watergate, began to drift. By 1977, when journalist Carl Bernstein published a definitive 25,000-word investigation in Rolling Stone magazine detailing the full scope of the CIA's media relationships, the political will to do anything about it had largely evaporated. The program was officially wound down, or so the public was told. What replaced it? Whether subtler influence operations continued under different names through different mechanisms is a question that has never received a fully satisfying answer. I want to return to that living room, that evening news, that trusted voice. The men who sat in those anchor chairs, most of them, were not CIA assets. Most of them believed they were doing honest work. Most of the journalism produced in that era was genuine. But the system around them had been shaped. The stories that reached their desks had been filtered. The access they depended upon had been strategically allocated. The information environment they operated in had been carefully managed by men in Langley, Virginia, who answered to no editor and no public. You were not lied to every night, but you were never told the full truth either. And the difference between those two things, that narrow, careful space between outright deception and managed reality, is where Operation Mockingbird lived for nearly 30 years. Operation Mockingbird shaped a